All right, it is the meat and potatoes, and a guest that I've been harrowing around and badgering to get onto the show. Incredibly excited. Ben Cooper, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an absolute delight. I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation. We are going to talk about a grudgingly old rugby player emerging to endurance glory, but we're going to go beyond that. What as I like to always do on the show is first dig into backgrounds and a little bit of your life story, and then we have got quite a personal story to talk about today. So why don't you first just paint the landscape? Tell the listeners where you grew up, what your background was, family, etc.
Yeah. So while don't let the baby face fool you, Matt. So I'm in my late 30s. So I grew up just outside London. So basically in a small town called Reading, which will mean a lot to British people and not a lot to others. It's not a town that's well known for being that exciting. So it's a kind of suburban just outside London. I grew up there. So late 80s, early 90s. Educated in and around there, went to sort of traditional UK schools, university, did the kind of whole traditional journey. Interestingly, and obviously I guess we'll come on to it a bit, but moved to London sort of post university, and kind of very traditional, what most people do in the UK, and ended up working in the real estate industry. So that's where I work now. Fantastic industry and an amazing firm, and we'll be talking about that shortly. And I'm now kind of managing director at the company there, dealing with a whole array of different things, but basically focused within part of a real estate private equity firm. So kind of really interesting firm and doing some really cool stuff. Trying to balance that with personal life and with having a family. So I've got a 3.5-year-old, and he'll definitely come up as part of the journey. So my wife and I've got a little boy. We live just in the middle of London now. And try and balance all of those occasionally competing objectives from balancing each other out too much.
I mean, you are the epitome of a time-starved athlete. You got 3.5-year-old. You're very, very busy role. You're MD, managing director, and your role at the organisation involves, I mean, effectively weekly travel, across international travel across Europe.
Every week I'm away somewhere pretty much. So in that, we'll come on to that in the context of being kind of time starved. So it's finding time with busy hours, the kind of hours that people would expect for that type of role. But also then building in travel and complicated travel and trying to make it home in time to get a little 3-year-old into the bath and read some bedtime stories and do exercise. So trying to balance all those things with an amazing but definitely demanding job and a job that I'm super proud to be doing, something I absolutely love, but is something that takes time and takes effort and takes focus.
It does, and I want to make, because I've worked with you for a couple of years, and you're not just a father of a 3.5-year. You're very, very active and involved as well. So you're navigating. You talk about getting him into the bath, et cetera, et cetera. That's it. I mean, you are a present and engaged father as well. I know that's very, very important to you as a part of the landscape of your life.
100%. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of parents. I mean, I could definitely record far longer than this podcast on how much that's brought to me. But like I'm a super involved dad. I love hanging out with the little guy. But it's also, I think, we'll come on to it. I think one of the things that I've really had to learn over the last couple of years is that ability. And one of the guys that works here, that again I'm sure we will allude to later, who Matt also coaches and knows very well, is an incredible mentor to me in everything I do. And he once really wisely talked about that need as you get further into life and have the sort of family side of things to work out a way of being absolutely present in everything you do. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I'm most focused on, is trying to be 100% present as a dad and as a husband, and combining that with sort of personal goals and professional ambition at the same time.
Well, I tell you, everything that young man knows, he learned directly from me. Put that
Exactly.
in there. But so before we get going on the journey, I do want to know your sporting background, or I want the listeners to know your sporting background. So growing up, sports, you grew up in England, west side of London, etc. So you're an elite endurance athlete. Is that accurate?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So prior to the stuff we've done, I had never run an endurance race in my entire life. I'd never run a race other than like school cross country runs, that kind of thing. So I'm a rugby player. That was my thing. I was a pretty decent rugby player. As a teenager, I was getting tryouts for professional teams and playing in county first teams and that kind of thing. So good standard. And I took that through to university. Um, for anyone that doesn't know much about rugby, it's a physical sport. Again, if you like US listeners who don't know, it's probably closest thing would be akin to American football. And the position I played, again, just to give you an idea of whether I'm a super lithe, gazelle-like marathon runner like Matt. The position I play would be closest probably to a tight end would be the best analogy. So
Wow, showing your knowledge of
American sport. Yeah. So tall, heavy, physical contact, that kind of game. So the opposite of an endurance athlete, to be honest, would be my athletic background.
Well, let's start to dig into the details then. You've got this this rugged rugby player, very busy, time-starved. Let's go back a couple of years when we first met, and I'm going to actually let you just paint the landscape and in your own words, explain our journey together. And I guess the nice way to maybe kick into it was, why don't you paint the landscape of where you were at the time, which was a challenging time for you? So as best as you can, sort of go back a couple of years and just give listeners an insight onto that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we met in 2021, I guess. Yeah, so 21, 22.
So.
And yeah, I was not doing well mentally or physically, and those are obviously massively connected, and we'll talk about that. But I've at various different points in my life struggled with my mental health. That's been something that's kind of always been there, has always been manageable. Basically, it's I've worked with kind of great people to help with that, and I've always done okay. And that's been to be candid, that's generalized anxiety disorder and depression and those sorts of things. Those haven't been things that have been extremely prevalent. They've just been some episodes. But I really found the period post-pandemic really tough. Like a lot of people, I found the experience of the pandemic really difficult. And my son was born during that period. So the back end of 2020, he was born. He was born in October 2020. And he was born prematurely as well. So we spent a few weeks in the intensive care. So it felt like years. We spent about 6 weeks in the intensive care with him, needing a lot of support and feeling like we'd never get out. And it was one of those situations where, we were basically the only thing I could do was go to the hospital. I couldn't see friends, I couldn't see family, and we very strictly upheld the rules, which was the right thing to do, but was a really, really difficult thing to do. And certainly that first period of time, my wife was in the hospital with him, so I was kind of leaving them in the intensive care and going home on my own. And for a few reasons, I think that then followed by the period afterwards, kind of pushed me over the edge a little bit, and I was burnt out. Effectively, I was just mentally really, really depleted, and I'd lost so much of the resilience that had been able to help me navigate some of the things that I'd found more difficult historically. Then we got back post-COVID, and we were in a period where, so again, to go back to my role involves traveling, as Matt mentioned, and that traveling fell away certainly in the first lockdown, and we got into the second lockdown, and traveling sort of opened up, and there were things that I'd wanted to do and needed to go and do, but I hadn't been able to. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do anything. So I gradually opened up, and that those were trips that I put off because we just couldn't do them, and eventually having to do them. But that would also mean I would go away on a business trip. I would have to drive across Europe, which would be like 12 hours on the road with loads of nasal swabs to get into different places and all of that fun. And then I get home and I'd be in quarantine for a couple of weeks and unable to go anywhere at all with a newborn baby. And just everything got too overwhelming at that point in time, really. And I, as I mentioned earlier on, I work with a couple of guys in the firm, the two partners of the firm who are like mentors to me in lots of different ways, and have been unbelievably supportive at every stage of my career, professionally and personally. And one of those guys suggested, look, just my view, my personal take, but I would strongly suggest you try and move your body around a bit. I think that will really help you to just kind of get over some of the overwhelming elements of life at the moment. And that was how he introduced me to Matt. And so yeah, you and I started talking then, and started work then. It's a very different time to what happened, and we can talk about that. But yeah, that was how we first.
Yeah, let's go, because we've had two chapters with each other, and the second one obviously being much more successful for you and for us as a partnership in a way. So, and I really remember a couple of things of the sort of first time around, and there was just a little bit of a gap between, but I'm just sort of separating it into chapters for our own conversation here. If you go back, I really remember making a few recommendations around a challenge, a goal, doing something with. But do you remember our conversations there? And I want you to try and go back, and you, from a coaching standpoint, you struggled to get traction. You in many ways, you just weren't quite ready. That was my coaching perspective. I'd love to hear your recollection of that first chapter and what you remember of it.
Yeah. I mean, so that's exactly right. I mean, there were things that I felt kind of capable of doing at the time. I was sort of would run a little bit, would kind of start to get on the exercise bike and have a little program to just move the body and kind of turn the engine over a little. To turn the engine over. See, I bought all the trademark terms, Matt. So I would kind of keep everything rolling. But there were things at the time that I just felt too overwhelmed by to be able to really move forward. Really, and you suggested. I remember really vividly, to your point about the challenge. I remember you saying to me, I can talk for hours about this, and I'll try not to, but I love nature. I love being in nature, which is harder, I think, where I live than where you live, so to get out and do it. I remember you saying to me, hey, maybe you should think about doing a kind of trek or a trip, or you should get in a canoe with some buddies and go down a river. And I remember thinking, I can't do that. I just can't. I will never be able to take a challenge like that on. That was my mindset at the time. I just felt like I think, because having been in a period where life felt about survival, basically, but life at the time, particularly when we were back in the intensive care in that period just after, my wife was amazing. She was an amazing woman, an incredibly mentally robust and brilliant woman in loads of different ways. She was really focused on what it took to be a mum at that point in time. And for anyone who's had a premature baby, I think the physiological reaction that women have in that moment, and milk coming in at difficult times, it was just an incredibly difficult experience. And she was so focused on that. And I felt like my job at the time was just to survive, right? All I had to do then was survive, and that made me mentally so depleted. And I couldn't get rid of that. I couldn't drop that from my mind. And I just felt completely incapable at that point I could hear you say it, and I felt like it sounded like a really great idea for someone else, just not for me, and that was really difficult right there.